The custody hearing was supposed to be about our father's care, not about me, but by the second hour it had become clear that my sister Vanessa had a different agenda entirely, one that had been building, I realized in retrospect, for weeks before we ever set foot in that mediation room. She sat across the table with her lawyer beside her, papers stacked in neat, color-coded folders that suggested hours of preparation, tabs marking specific pages, everything organized with a precision that felt less like diligence and more like a person building a case rather than trying to solve a family problem. I remember noticing that detail early on and feeling a small, cold unease settle into my stomach, a sense that this hearing had already been decided, in her mind, before we'd even walked through the courthouse doors. The room itself was smaller than I'd expected, more conference room than courtroom, with a long table and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly washed out, tired in a way that had nothing to do with how they actually felt. Judge Patricia Hollis sat at the head of it, and for the first 2 hours she'd let both sides present their positions with minimal interruption, occasionally asking a clarifying question about medical records or scheduling conflicts, her expression giving almost nothing away as she took notes in small, careful handwriting that I found myself watching more than I probably should have, trying to read something into the rhythm of her pen. We'd gotten through the basic facts by then. Our father's stroke 8 weeks earlier, sudden and severe, leaving him partially paralyzed on his left side and struggling badly with speech in those early weeks, words coming out scrambled or not at all, a terrifying thing to witness in a man who'd always been sharp and quick with language, a retired high school English teacher who used to correct our grammar at the dinner table well into our 30s. We'd covered the timeline of his hospitalization, the rehabilitation facility he'd since moved to, the outpatient therapy schedule that was slowly, incrementally restoring some of what the stroke had taken. All of it had been dry, procedural, the kind of information that could be presented calmly because it wasn't yet about blame. Then the conversation turned to who should hold medical power of attorney going forward, and everything shifted. Our father's original estate documents, drafted 11 years earlier when he was still fully himself, had named both Vanessa and me as joint medical proxies, a decision he'd made deliberately, according to his attorney's notes, because he'd wanted both his daughters involved in any major decisions about his care, trusting that we'd work through disagreements together rather than have one of us hold unilateral authority over the other. That arrangement had functioned without incident for over a decade, mostly because it had never actually been tested. Our father had been healthy, independent, living alone in the house we'd grown up in, needing nothing from either of us beyond the occasional visit and holiday phone call. The stroke had changed all of that overnight, and with it, apparently, Vanessa's willingness to honor an arrangement she'd never previously objected to. She'd never forgiven me, I think, though she'd never said as much directly, for being the one our father called first from the hospital, in the confused, frightened hour after his symptoms started, his speech already beginning to slur on the phone in a way that had sent me sprinting for my car keys before I'd even fully processed what was happening. I'd driven 3 hours through the night to reach the hospital, arriving before dawn, sitting with him in the ICU through that first terrifying 24 hours while doctors ran tests and monitored him for further complications. Vanessa, who lived across the country, hadn't arrived until the following afternoon, delayed by flight availability and a work commitment she hadn't been able to immediately drop, entirely reasonable circumstances that I'd never once held against her, though I sometimes wondered, watching her over the following weeks, whether she held them against herself. Whether the guilt of that missing day had curdled into something else entirely once she finally arrived. Because from the moment she got there, she began questioning everything, every decision I'd made in her absence, second-guessing conversations I'd already had with the neurology team, requesting second opinions on treatment plans the doctors had already carefully explained to me in detail. I'd try to be patient with it at first, understanding that fear and helplessness often express themselves as control, that she was processing her own guilt and grief in the only language she seemed to have available to her. But by the 3rd week, her scrutiny had curdled into something harder and more deliberate, and I'd started to realize she wasn't just anxious, she was building toward something. That something turned out to be a formal petition, filed through her own attorney, asking the court to name her sole medical proxy for our father instead of maintaining the joint arrangement he'd specified himself, back when he was still lucid enough to make that choice deliberately. The petition cited irreconcilable differences in caregiving philosophy as its primary justification, vague enough language that I hadn't fully understood, reading it for the first time, how far she intended to go to support that claim. My lawyer, a calm, methodical man named Andre Whitfield, who came recommended by a friend who'd gone through a similarly ugly custody dispute over an aging parent 2 years earlier, put a steadying hand briefly on my arm under the table as the hearing progressed into its second hour, a small gesture that I understood, even in the moment, as a warning to stay composed no matter what came next. I'd told him, weeks earlier, sitting in his office preparing for exactly this possibility, that I was worried Vanessa might try something like this, might dig into my medical history and use it against me in front of a judge. 6 years ago, after a difficult divorce that had unraveled nearly every stable structure in my life at once, my marriage, my sense of who I was outside of it, even my relationship with food and sleep for a stretch of months, I still didn't fully like to think about. I'd been diagnosed with major depressive disorder. I'd spent 3 months in outpatient treatment, therapy twice a week, medication that took 4 separate attempts before we found something that actually worked without turning me into someone I didn't recognize. It hadn't been a secret, exactly. My father had known, had driven up to stay with me for 2 weeks during the worst of it, had never once treated it as anything other than an illness that needed treating, the same way he'd have treated a broken bone or a bad flu. Andre had told me not to worry, that a 6-year-old depression diagnosis with a clean record of treatment and demonstrated stability afterward wasn't the kind of evidence that typically swayed a family court judge who dealt, day in and day out, in actual patterns of harm and neglect rather than old paperwork dressed up as present danger. I believed him, mostly, in the weeks leading up to the hearing. But hearing Vanessa actually say it, out loud in a courtroom, on the record, in front of a judge who would now have that word sitting somewhere in her notes about me, was entirely different from anticipating it in the abstract comfort of a lawyer's office. My sister has a documented history of mental illness, Vanessa said, looking directly at the judge, her voice steady in a way that told me she'd rehearsed this exact sentence more than once. I don't think she's stable enough to be making life-or-death decisions for our father. The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when someone has said something designed to detonate rather than inform, a silence with texture to it, heavier than the procedural pauses that had punctuated the hearing up to that point. I felt my face go hot, my hands curling into fists under the table where no one could see them, years of careful, hard-won stability suddenly reduced, in a single sentence, to a disqualifying character flaw rather than the medical episode I'd worked so hard to move through and had been fully stable from for half a decade. Judge Hollis had been quiet through most of the proceeding, letting both sides present their positions with minimal interruption. But when Vanessa made her statement, the judge set down her pen with a deliberate, unhurried motion and looked up, first at Vanessa, then briefly at me, before returning her full attention to my sister with an expression that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something sharper. "Ms. Ellery," she said, using Vanessa's last name with a formality that somehow made the moment feel heavier than it already was, "I want to make sure I understand what you're presenting as evidence here. You're telling this court your sister is unfit to hold medical power of attorney based on a diagnosis from 6 years ago. Can you tell me what specific incidents, in those 6 years, demonstrate that this diagnosis has affected her judgment or caused harm to another person?" Vanessa opened her mouth, and then closed it again. The silence stretched out long enough that I watched my sister's lawyer glance sideways at her, clearly expecting an answer that wasn't coming, his pen hovering above his legal pad without moving, the confident rhythm he'd maintained through most of the hearing suddenly interrupted. Vanessa's composure, which had carried her through the first 2 hours with a kind of practiced certainty, seemed to falter for the first time all afternoon, and I watched her search for something to say, some specific example she could point to, some incident concrete enough to justify what she'd just claimed, and come up with nothing solid enough to offer the room. She struggled for a while. Vanessa finally said, her voice noticeably quieter than it had been a moment earlier. After her divorce. It was concerning. Concerning to whom, and in what way? Judge Hollis asked, her tone even, almost gentle, but with an edge underneath it that made clear this wasn't a question she intended to let slide past unanswered. The kind of question that seemed to invite honesty precisely because it left no room for vague deflection. "I'm asking because petitions like this one carry real weight, Ms. Ellery. If I'm going to remove someone's name from a medical proxy arrangement that their own father specifically drafted years ago, with the explicit intention of having both his daughters involved in his care, I need considerably more than a historical diagnosis. I need evidence of present, demonstrable risk. Has your sister missed medical appointments for your father? Made a decision regarding his care that endangered him in any way? Failed to respond adequately during a crisis?" "No," Vanessa admitted, quieter still now, something in her posture shifting, shoulders drawing in slightly. "Nothing like that." "In fact," Judge Hollis continued, glancing down at a page in the folder in front of her, running one finger along a line of text before looking back up, "the medical record shows she was the one who got him to the hospital within the treatment window that made his current recovery possible. The attending physician's notes specifically credit rapid action with limiting the extent of the stroke's neurological damage. Is that accurate, to your knowledge?" Vanessa nodded, barely, her jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere on the table in front of her rather than meeting the judge's gaze, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly for the first time in weeks, watching the narrative she'd spent a month carefully constructing begin to come apart under nothing more than a few direct, procedural questions, the kind any competent judge would ask, the kind that had nothing to do with sympathy for me and everything to do with the actual mechanics of evidence. "I want to be clear about something," the judge said, and her voice shifted now, addressing the room more broadly rather than Vanessa alone, carrying the particular weight of someone who had clearly had a version of this exact conversation many times before, in many different configurations of grieving, frightened families. "A mental health diagnosis, treated appropriately and demonstrably stable for a period of years, is not disqualifying evidence in this court, and it should not be treated as such by anyone bringing a petition before me. If it were, we would be disqualifying an enormous portion of capable, loving caregivers across this country from making decisions for the people they love, and we would be doing so based on stigma rather than fact, based on fear of a word rather than any actual pattern of behavior. What matters to me, in evaluating a petition like this one, is behavior, pattern, and present capacity. I have heard nothing today that demonstrates any of those three things have been compromised in your sister." I sat there, throat tight, blinking hard against tears I didn't want to shed in front of Vanessa or her lawyer, or the small handful of court staff moving quietly around the edges of the room, feeling something caught between vindication and a strange, unexpected grief that it had taken a judge's direct, procedural question to say what I'd wanted to say to my own sister myself for weeks now, that my history wasn't a weapon she got to reach for whenever she found herself losing an argument on its actual merits. Andre leaned over and asked quietly if I wanted a brief recess before we continued. I shook my head, wanting instead to see the hearing through to its end while the momentum of the judge's words still hung visibly in the room, still seemed to be working on Vanessa in some way I could see playing out across her face. The rest of the hearing moved differently after that exchange. Vanessa's lawyer tried, gamely, to pivot toward other grievances he'd apparently been holding in reserve, a disagreement over our father's physical therapy schedule that I'd resolved weeks earlier after a single phone call with the facility, a difference of opinion about a specialist referral that had, in reality, been settled amicably between Vanessa and me before any of this litigation started. But each new complaint landed with noticeably less force than the last, thin objections that couldn't recover the ground her mental health accusation had already cost her, the judge's expression growing steadily more skeptical with each new thread her lawyer attempted to pull. By the time both sides finished presenting, nearly 3 hours after we'd started, Judge Hollis didn't take long to deliberate. She ruled to maintain the joint medical proxy arrangement our father had originally established over a decade earlier, explicitly citing his own documented intent as the primary basis for her decision, and added a stipulation that both daughters attend a court-recommended family mediation program over the following months to address what she diplomatically termed communication breakdowns that appear to be affecting his care more than any genuine disagreement about treatment. She looked at both of us as she said this last part, not unkindly, and there was something almost weary in her expression. The look of someone who'd watched too many families do exactly this to each other over an aging parent's decline, grief curdling into blame, because blame at least felt like it had somewhere to go. Outside the courthouse afterward, the late afternoon light harsh and unfamiliar after hours in that fluorescent-lit room, Vanessa caught up to me in the parking lot before I reached my car, and for a moment I braced myself for another confrontation, my whole body tensing in anticipation of whatever came next, some new grievance or justification I'd have to absorb and process on top of everything else. "I shouldn't have said that in there," she said instead, arms crossed tightly over her chest, not quite meeting my eyes, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years, stripped of the sharp confidence that had carried her through most of the hearing. "About you." I was angry and losing, and I reached for the thing I knew would hurt you the most. "You did," I said, and I wasn't ready to make it easy for her. Not yet, not after weeks of feeling like my worst period had been dredged up and turned into a courtroom exhibit for strangers to evaluate. That diagnosis was 6 years ago, Vanessa. I rebuilt my entire life after that. My job, my sense of myself, everything. I've been the one showing up for Dad every single week since his stroke, driving up on weekends, sitting through his speech therapy appointments, learning how to help him with the exercises the therapist gave him. And you used the hardest thing I've ever gone through as a weapon because you were losing an argument you started and didn't know how else to win it. She didn't defend herself this time, didn't offer the kind of deflection I'd half expected, just nodded slowly, something unguarded and tired moving across her face that I hadn't seen from her in months, maybe longer. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. I think I've just been so scared of losing him, scared that I wasn't there enough at the beginning and now I'll never make up for it, and it came out sideways at you because you were closer than the fear was. You were right there in front of me, and he wasn't, not the way he used to be." We didn't fully resolve anything in that parking lot, standing beside my car with the courthouse looming behind us, both of us emotionally wrung out from 3 hours of formal proceedings that had exposed things about our family neither of us had wanted made public. The mediation sessions the judge ordered turned out to be slow, occasionally frustrating work over the following months, a rotating cast of old resentment surfacing that had little to do with our father's stroke directly and everything to do with decades of sibling history, who Mom had favored, who'd left home first and felt guilty about it, who'd stayed closer geographically and quietly resented being taken for granted because of it, none of which either of us had ever properly addressed. Before circumstances forced us into a room together with a trained mediator, taking careful notes. But something had genuinely shifted that day in the hearing room, some recognition on Vanessa's part of exactly how far she'd been willing to go, what she'd been willing to use against me when cornered by her own fear, and some recognition on mine of how much I'd let her old assumptions about my stability sit unchallenged for too many years, never quite finding the moment or the courage to push back directly. Our father, once he was well enough to understand what had happened in that courtroom, Vanessa told him herself, eventually, a conversation I wasn't present for and never asked the details of, squeezed my hand with his good side during one of my regular visits and said, in the halting, effortful speech he was still slowly relearning, word by patient word, that he'd always trusted me to look out for both of them, for him and for his relationship with Vanessa both. I've held on to that sentence more tightly than almost anything else from that entire difficult year, turning it over sometimes on harder days, a small, steady anchor in the middle of everything that had threatened, for a while, to pull our family apart for good.